Bima hadn't set foot in Tirta Sari for over a decade. As the bus rattled over the uneven dirt road, memories of his childhood flooded back, but they were tinged with an uneasy sense of foreboding. The village was a shadow of its former self, its once vibrant streets now silent and overgrown with weeds. The houses, many of which had fallen into disrepair, stood like weary sentinels guarding the secrets of a bygone era. The bus finally came to a halt at the village's edge, and Bima stepped off, his shoes sinking into the mud. He had come to visit his grandmother, the last member of his family still living in Tirta Sari. The doctors had given up on her, and she had insisted on returning to her ancestral home to spend her final days. Pakamad, an old friend of his grandmother's, greeted him at the bus stop. The old man's face was lined with years of hardship, but his eyes still held a glint of warmth. "Bima," he said, his voice rasping from age, "I'm glad you're here." Bima shook Pakamad's hand and nodded. "It's good to see you, Pakamad. How is Nenek?" "She's been waiting for you," Pakamad replied solemnly. "Come, I'll take you to her." As they walked through the village, Bima couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. The streets were eerily quiet, and the few remaining villagers moved about with a palpable sense of unease. The houses were shrouded in darkness, their windows covered with thick curtains. They arrived at Bima's grandmother's house, a small, weathered structure that had seen better days. The roof was sagging, and the paint was peeling, but it was still home. Bima hesitated at the door, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what awaited him inside. Pakamad placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "She's been strong, but the end is near. You should go to her." With a deep breath, Bima pushed open the door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of herbs and something else, something faintly metallic. The living room was dimly lit by a single candle, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. His grandmother's room was just down the hall. Bima approached the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear her shallow, labored breathing. He pushed the door open and entered the room. His grandmother lay in bed, her frail body barely making a dent in the mattress. Her eyes, though cloudy with age, brightened when she saw him. "Bima," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Nenek," he said, forcing a smile as he took her hand. "I'm here." Her grip was weak, but there was a firmness in her eyes. "I've seen him," she said suddenly, her gaze shifting to the shadows in the room. The man without a face. Bima's smile faltered. "Nenek, it's just your illness. You're not well." "No," she insisted, her voice trembling. "He's real. He walks through the village at night, searching. You must be careful. Don't let him find you." Before Bima could respond, a knock at the door startled him. Pakamad appeared in the doorway, his face pale. "It's time," he said quietly. "We need to prepare." Bima looked back at his grandmother, who had closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. He nodded and followed Pakamad out of the room, a gnawing fear settling in his stomach. Nightfall cloaked the village in darkness. The only sounds, the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Bima found himself alone in the house with his grandmother, who had fallen into a restless sleep. Footsteps began again, faint at first, then growing louder and more insistent. Desperate for answers, Bima searched the house and stumbled upon an old chest in the attic. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, and a heavy padlock secured it. With some effort, he managed to pry it open. Inside the chest were several items: a leather-bound journal, a bundle of old letters tied with twine, and a small, intricately carved box. Bima picked up the journal, its cover cracked and worn. As he flipped through the pages, he found his grandfather's neat handwriting detailing a dark and disturbing history. The journal spoke of a pact made by the village elders centuries ago. During a devastating plague, they had summoned a spirit to protect them in exchange for a human sacrifice. The ritual was interrupted, and the spirit was cursed to wander the village, searching for the sacrifice that was never completed. The spirit became the man without a face, figure doomed to roam in search of what was lost. The journal's revelations sent a chill down Bima's spine. The footsteps he had been hearing were the spirit's search for the sacrifice, and now it was getting closer. He realized the only way to end the torment was to complete the ritual. He turned his attention to the small box. Inside was a silver knife, its blade tarnished with age. The journal had mentioned that the ritual required a life to be given willingly. Bima knew what he had to do, but the thought of offering his own life was terrifying. The footsteps grew louder, more persistent. Bima knew he had to act quickly. Took the knife and left the house, determined to perform the ritual at Tanatua, the village's sacred ground. The path to Tanatua was overgrown and difficult to navigate, but Bima pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency. Footsteps seemed to follow him, growing louder with each step. Clearing, marked by ancient stones and strange symbols, appeared like a beacon in the darkness. As Bima stepped into the clearing, he felt a cold, oppressive presence. The man without a face emerged from the shadows, tall figure wrapped in tattered cloth. Its featureless face was a smooth, unsettling void. The spirit moved towards Bima with deliberate, measured steps. Bima's heart raced as he raised the knife. He had prepared himself for this moment. Facing the spirit in person was far more terrifying than he had imagined. The spirit seemed to waver, its form flickering in the moonlight. "What do you want?" Bima demanded, his voice trembling. The spirit's movement slowed, as though considering his question. For a moment, Bima thought he saw something. A flicker of understanding, a glimmer of sadness in the spirit's empty eyes. Before Bima could react, the spirit lunged at him. Bima barely managed to evade its grasp, cold of its touch sending a shiver down his spine. He stumbled, the knife slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. Desperate, Bima tried to remember the ritual's details. The spirit was bound to the village because the pact had been incomplete. The only way to appease it was to offer a life willingly, but he couldn't bring himself to harm anyone else, not even himself. The spirit's relentless pursuit forced Bima to rethink his strategy. He realized that the spirit's anger was a manifestation of its own loss and desperation. The true sacrifice was not about taking a life, but offering something of oneself to complete the pact. Bima's mind raced as he fled the clearing. He needed to complete the ritual, but it had to be done in a way that would finally bring peace to the spirit. He remembered the journal's final passages, which hinted at an alternative way to fulfill the pact, one that required a selfless act of courage. Returning to the clearing, Bima took a deep breath and prepared himself. He knew he had to offer his own life, but not through violence. Instead, he decided to use the knife in a symbolic gesture, acknowledging the spirit's pain and completing the pact with dignity. As the spirit approached, Bima held the knife aloft, his hands trembling. He spoke softly, his voice filled with resolve. "I offer this life to complete the pact. May it bring you peace." He lowered the knife, placing it gently on the ground before the spirit. The act was not one of bloodshed, but of acknowledgement and sacrifice. The spirit's form flickered, its anger seeming to dissolve as it approached the knife. A strange warmth spread through the clearing, and Bima felt a sense of calm wash over him. The spirit's presence grew lighter, its form becoming less menacing. For the first time, Bima saw a flicker of gratitude in the spirit's eyes. The spirit reached out, its touch no longer cold but surprisingly gentle. Bima felt a deep sense of peace as the spirit's form began to fade. The oppressive weight that had hung over the village seemed to lift, replaced by a serene silence. As dawn broke, the village of Tirta Sari was bathed in the soft light of morning. The air was crisp and clean, and the once ominous atmosphere had been replaced by a sense of tranquility. Pak Ahmad found Bima lying in the clearing, his expression peaceful. The knife was still by his side. There was no sign of blood. The villagers gathered to pay their respects. They buried Bima in the sacred ground, honoring him as a hero who had sacrificed himself and the village's suffering. The spirit, now at peace, was no longer a threat. In the days that followed, Tirta Sari began to recover. The villagers repaired their homes and fields, and the sense of dread that had haunted them for years gradually faded. The story of Bima's bravery was passed down through generations, ensuring that the village would never forget the price of its salvation. The village, once shrouded in fear, now thrived with renewed hope and a sense of unity. Bima's sacrifice had not been in vain. The darkness that had plagued Tirta Sari was gone, replaced by the light of a new beginning.